my name is Lynn and I'm studying to become a BCBA. In today's video, we're going to cover Unit 9 of Intro to Behavioral Analysis Concepts and Principles. It is the last unit, by the way, of this section, so hopefully I've covered enough. This one is about the intro to verbal behavior. So by verbal behavior, they don't necessarily mean things that are talking, they mean any form of communication. So it could be signing, it could be writing, it can be Morse code, any sort of trained audience can understand you. So it's verbal behavior, and it always requires at least one trained audience and you, or you can be your own audience as long as there is something occurring and there's communication occurring. The unit first covers how verbal behavior is selected. There is cultural selection and operant selection. Cultural selection is basically the environment and the trained audience that engages in that verbal behavior chooses how that verbal behavior is shaped and occurs, and it is passed down that way. Operant behavior is an individual's verbal behavior. So an individual will elicit some sort of signing or speaking or talking of some sort, and they will choose how that communication continues and if it continues. There are 5 types of pure verbal operants. A pure verbal operant will be either a tact, a mand, a duplicate, a codic, or an intraverbal. A tact is, just think contact. It's describing or naming something. You see a dog, and you're like, oh, that's a dog. You hear a helicopter, and you're like, oh, I heard a helicopter. So you are tacting, you are describing or naming or labeling the items in the environment. A mand is, just imagine short for command or demand, right? So a mand is, I want cookie. So I saw a cookie, so I tacted cookie, but I'm pointing to it and wanting it. So the verbal behavior is also including the relationship between how you're affecting the environment, right? So you see a cookie, you could say cookie, and that's a tact. You see a cookie, but or if you say cookie and there's no cookie around, but someone gives you a cookie, that's a mand, because that was it. You were essentially requesting it. A mand is also the only thing, the only verbal operant that is controlled by a motivating operation. So it's something internal, so to speak. There's an establishing operation for it, which we've covered before. Because of that, you can just be sitting on the couch and all of a sudden say, I want popcorn. That's a mand, because you didn't see popcorn, you didn't smell popcorn. There was no stimulus eliciting that beyond your personal motivating operation. The duplicate verbal operant is basically, imagine duplication. There are 3 types of duplics. There's echoic, where someone says dog, and I repeat dog. There's copy text, where you see a word written and then you write it because you are just duplicating what's being seen. And there's mimetic, where you are mimicking what's happening. So someone signs dog, I can't remember my sign language right now, and you sign dog back. So those are the 3 types of duplics. Codic is the combination of a duplicate. So you see the word dog and you say dog, or someone signs dog and you write it. So there's no point-to-point correspondence. Point-to-point correspondence, by the way, refers to the beginning, middle, and end of an antecedent matching the initial stimulus. So in duplics, there's 100% point-to-point correspondence. You see the word DOG, so you write DOG. That is point-to-point correspondence. Everything is the same. Versus codic, there is point-to-point correspondence, but it's not the same form. So you see the word DOG, and then instead of writing it, you say it. So both have point-to-point correspondence, but one is a different form, and the other one duplicates the form, right? So duplicate and codic. The last one is easily the most common, and that's intraverbal. Intraverbal is like saying, what has 4 legs and a tail? A dog. The presented question of what has 4 legs and a tail, and the answer, a dog, is an intraverbal. A dog has no point-to-point correspondence with the antecedent, which is what has 4 legs and a tail. You aren't repeating anything. You're not coding anything, so you didn't see the word dog, and you're not asking for a dog. You're also not you're not labeling a dog either, because someone else provided a verbal prompt and you were meant to respond to it. So a lot of times people will just say for intraverbal, like, what do you want to eat? Pizza. That's an intraverbal. It's the most common element of conversation, essentially. The next thing that the unit covers is listener behavior. So within verbal behavior, there's a speaker and then there's a listener, right? A listener can be part of an audience, or an audience can be your listener essentially. But regardless of if it's a group of people or one person, they have to be a trained listener. So if you're speaking English, they have to be able to speak English back. And a listener will always provide either the stimulus or the consequence. So the antecedent stimulus or the consequence, or sometimes both, that will interact with your verbal behavior. For instance, if I say, oh, I need a cookie, and then my brother gets up, goes to the kitchen and grabs a cookie and gives it to me, my brother just engaged in nonverbal listener behavior because he just performed an action essentially. It was technically considered respondent listening or respondent language, but I really hate that term because there's no discussion happening, but it's still called language. But it's basically confirming that he understood what I said and he reacted to it and responded appropriately, and the consequence was I received a cookie. So he's part of a trained audience because he understood my words, and then he reacted to it and mediated and maintained my verbal behavior. The entire example that I used just now of me saying, I want a cookie, and my brother going to get a cookie, that is called a verbal episode. And that is the most basic unit of a speaker and listener relationship. More often than not, when there is a speaker and listener relationship occurring, so a verbal episode occurring, the roles will switch. So I will say, I want a cookie, and my brother can then respond with, okay, what type, right? So suddenly we're changing roles. That's very common and a frequent occurrence. The last part of this unit covers the 7 dimensions of ABA. This one is a little technical, so I won't go too deep into each one, but I will explain what each one stands for. There's a mnemonic that's provided that I thought the professors were pretty clever with, or I'm not sure if it was the professors or the textbooks that provided it, but basically the 7 dimensions of ABA have the mnemonic of get a cab. So each letter of that sentence stands for something. The G in get stands for generality, which basically means, can the effects be generalized? When you're intervening in ABA, can the effects of what you're teaching be generalized? E in get is effective. So is the behavior that you are influencing or manipulating, is it going to change in the correct direction, and is it going to change to a practical degree? So for instance, if a kid is screaming in class 10 times and you intervene with ABA, and then at the end of the day or at the end of the training he only screens 8 times, that's not really a practical degree. It's still disruptive. It's still going to impact his environment to a degree that they still think that more intervention is required, right? So it needs to affect the behavior in a practical degree and in the correct direction. Obviously, if he starts screaming more, then we're doing something wrong, right? The T stands for technological, which is pretty simple. All it means is that anytime we write down a program or explain something, it needs to be in words that are understood and can be replicated. So you write down the description of the programming in such a way that anyone can read it and anyone can perform those actions consistently. So technologically, it needs to have full understanding, right? Like everyone should be able to understand it. The first A, because there's 2 A's, we'll just say stands for applied. Applied just means that we need to focus on a socially significant behavior. If we're going to apply ABA, let's help this kid brush teeth or be able to change clothes. Let's not focus on like if he can discriminate between dog breeds, you know. Let's have it be more or less functional to their life. The C is conceptually systematic. What that means is any intervention that we put out in the world has to be directly related to a basic principle or concept within the field of behavior analysis. So once again, this is a natural science. We have a lot of studies and experimentation behind us, and we have determined a lot of different modules of which we can use to change behavior depending on how we affect the environment. That being said, we do have concepts and principles that we need to stick to because we have all the data that supports that they are the most effective in the world. So we need to be able to make sure that any programming that we create is directly connected to or related to those concepts. The next A is analytic, and that's the scientific part of ABA, which basically means that you need to be able to prove a functional relation between the behavior and its environment through systematic manipulation. So you need to be able to show that this behavior is most likely caused by these antecedents, because if you manipulate these antecedents, then it has a direct effect on the behavior. The last letter, B, is for behavior. Now go figure. One of the dimensions of ABA that we focus on is behavior. And that basically means that behavior is in its own right to be changed. We're not changing if a kid likes watching Barney. We're not changing if someone doesn't eat a lot of apples or something like that. We're changing a behavior that can be manipulated from the environment. Right? So it needs to be functional, it needs to be realistic, and it's the behavior that we are focused on changing, right? It's not the person that we're manipulating, it's their behavior and how they react in the environment. So those are the 7 dimensions of ABA, and that's where the chapter kind of closes on, which is kind of funny because it's an intro to something. But after this, I'm going to go into my next class, which is Intro to Ethics. So hopefully that rundown of all of my units was really helpful. I know that I think unit 5 and 6 were probably the hardest for me because they were so technically difficult or technically just tedious. But let me know which one sounds or feels the hardest to understand. I'd be really interested to see where people struggled or where people would want like more examples or something, because explaining things in these videos also helps me kind of solidify what I know and also helps me review everything that I think I know, right? Like I've already found mistakes in my own notes. So just let me know in the comments if you have any questions or concerns. All right, I'll see you in the next video.